The most awful story this day, this week, this time continues to be the famine in Africa. The tragedy of men, women, and little children by the thousands dying of thirst, starvation, and disease. Clearly the most disgusting sidebar story to this main event is the one of political murder, the continuing charge that with the silent acquiescence of the United Nations and others, the Ethiopian government is intentionally preventing food and other aid from reaching some of its people. They are the residents of the provinces of Eritrea and Tigre in northern Ethiopia near the Sudan. There have been civil wars going on in these areas for years, for some as many as 25 years. For some, the wars are for local autonomy from the Ethiopian government. For others, it's the overthrow of the Ethiopian government completely. It is this political part of the Ethiopian famine tragedy that we focus on first and foremost tonight. Representatives of the Ethiopian government and the United Nations are here, as is the head of the U.S. government's relief organization. But first, the charge is laid out in this documentary report by correspondent Terence McKenna of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation for the CBC's The Journal program.
Anyone who believes that the Ethiopian government is in control of the whole country is in for a surprise when they visit the famine areas in the north. It is the TPLF, the Tigre People's Liberation Front, that calls the shots here. They're a coalition of opposition groups from Tigre province that banded together and launched a civil war 9 years ago. Although some of the leaders are said to be communist, they claim they're not fighting for any political dogma. They're fighting to save their Tigrinya language and culture. The rebels are well organized and well armed. The weapons in this field exercise all captured from the Ethiopian army. They are now allies with the rebels in the neighboring province of Eritrea, who've been fighting the government for 23 years. You have to look at a map of Ethiopia to understand how the political situation affects the famine areas in the north. The one major road from the capital of Addis Ababa through the northern provinces of Tigray and Eritrea is controlled by Ethiopian government troops. On that road, at Korum and Mekelle, are the refugee camps familiar from recent television newscasts. There are fewer than 200,000 people in the government camps along this road, but there are up to 4 million people at risk of starvation living in the rebel-held areas around the province of Tigray. The Ethiopian government seldom enters rebel territory, but they tell the world that they are delivering food everywhere in the country. This is the Ethiopian government camp of Korum, where 54,000 famine victims are receiving daily rations. The government, though, has a different approach to the millions of famine victims in the surrounding hills controlled by the guerrillas, where observers see a military solution being imposed.
I believe, especially after this trip and talking to the drought migrants, that the Ethiopian government intends to starve out a population that it has been unsuccessful in crushing militarily for the past almost 10 years.
The military authorities, essentially the junta, saw food shortage in Eritrea, Tigray, as a strategic weapon in their own hands. And they were quite prepared, as I suppose military authorities have been throughout history, quite prepared to use the enemy's shortage of supplies as a weapon.
The famine victims in rebel-held areas have been deprived of food and medicine for so long that when they finally reach help, it's often too late. These families have watched their loved ones die, killed not only by the intentional withholding of food, but killed by the active government campaigns against them.
We have eyewitness reports, Europeans as well as Ethiopians, who saw the army going from place to place and burning crops in a place where crops are very precious. And that cannot mean anything else as trying to serve the people.
The combination of the civil war and the drought has triggered a massive exodus of people from the rebel-held areas of northern Ethiopia toward the border with neighboring Sudan. especially to the area around the Sudanese town of Kassala. To hold back the approaching waves of humanity, the rebels are attempting to build their own relief operation. On the outskirts of Kassala, the Relief Society of Tigre is running a mill where wheat donated by the International Red Cross is ground into flour. The biggest problem is how to transport this food to those in need. The rebels have only 36 trucks to get food into the millions of famine victims in Tigre. Both trucks and flour are in pitifully short supply. We decide to follow one of the truck convoys into the rebel territory of northern Ethiopia, accompanied by a Tigrinya-speaking translator guide and some rebel soldiers ordered to protect us. We wanted to see for ourselves how many refugees are in the pipeline and why they are moving. There are allegations that the rebels are exaggerating the refugee problem. Some governments and aid agencies don't even believe the rebels can make these food deliveries because of the lack of roads across the mountains and desert. But we followed these 10-ton four-wheel drive vehicles as they drove in and out of the soft sand, through riverbeds and over mountains. We were told that some of these trucks had been stolen from the Ethiopian government by the rebels. After nightfall, the trucks rendezvous at a prearranged spot on the Ethiopia-Sudan border. The loads often work loose during the rough ride and have to be refastened and rearranged. There's a man with a machine gun in the front seat with every driver, more scouts and checkpoints along the way. The convoys travel at night to avoid attack from the Ethiopian Air Force, which rules the sky during daylight hours. Just before dawn, we enter a rebel transit camp. And by sunrise, the trucks have disappeared. They're hidden under the trees and layers of camouflage, invisible to Ethiopian pilots. Everyone sleeps on the sand beside the vehicles. Coming into this transit camp from the other direction are refugees who have been walking most of the night. They too are occasionally strafed by the Air Force. We were told to expect 2,000 or 3,000 people stopping overnight in this camp, but there were closer to 8,000. And around 5 in the afternoon, they all poured into the dried-up riverbed and began again the long night's walk. Many have been walking for 30, 40, even 50 days. Most say they intend to return one day to their homes and possessions, but the journey is so arduous that many never go back. There are 24 rebel camps like this one in western Tigray, about 300,000 people who will wait as long as they can for food and then begin to walk. The allegation is that they are being driven out of the rebel areas intentionally by the government of Ethiopia.
The government of Ethiopia kills us and burns us. Wherever we go, without any reason, they kill, burn, and destroy every person.
The refugees we spoke to confirm the stories of mistreatment by the Ethiopian government. Many say there have been bombardments and massacres, huts full of people burned by soldiers. Some were turned away from government feeding centers.
We went 8 or 9 times to government camps. We went to Mecho, but we were asked to leave. Some people died of starvation there. There were others who remained there because they were tired and they were unable to leave. After traveling 1 to 2 days, we went home exhausted. After those problems, the government gathered the people, husbands and wives, and burned them to death. The district officer of Dika Afarian told us that the government will give us food aid. After this, we went to the camp in a group. Some people were given 8 tins of food each. The rest were told to go back home without getting anything. The people who had nothing to eat hesitated and preferred to stay there. But the district officer started to beat us with a stick, insisting that we should go back home. Then we went back home empty-handed.
How many people were closer to an Ethiopian government camp but came here instead?
And I spoke to many of your citizens who walked for 20 days, 30 days, 40 days. They said they were closer to government camps, but that they walked all the way towards the Sudan. Why would they be doing that?
No, I don't think so. I don't see why they would do that.
How many people have ever been bombed or shot at by the Ethiopian government here?
I have heard people tell me stories about bombing and strafing by the Ethiopian Air Force, and they were really scared of the government, and that's why they walked so far to get towards the Sudan.
I don't think so. Well, people who cross the border to Sudan, well, they are sometimes obliged to create stories because they feel that they can get sympathy only if they tell some dramatic stories. But I can assure you, in terms of sincerity, we have tried even to distribute food even to the rebels themselves.
10 years ago, there was another famine here. Over 200,000 people died, many because the government of Haile Selassie was embarrassed by the famine and so covered it up. We now know that the Foreign Diplomatic Corps here, the United Nations, and other international food organizations knew what was happening but said nothing. This time around, the famine itself is no secret, but once again, the world's major food agencies are not saying anything about how the government of Ethiopia is holding back food from most of the famine victims. The agencies themselves are caught up in a tangled web of politics, conflicting mandates, and internal struggles. More people are dying because of it.
I don't think it's a conspiracy of silence. I don't think the UN agencies are capable of a conspiracy of silence. I think it's much more a combination of straight incompetence and a lot of jockeying for position. The UN agencies were so busy knifing each other, and that they were at least as much part of the problem as they were of the solution.
Among the donor organizations that meet regularly in Addis Ababa, the United Nations agencies are the most prominent and powerful. It's true that they don't always get along, but in Ethiopia, they had more serious problems. The UN organizations have been effectively silenced by their mandates. For example, take UNDRO, the United Nations Disaster Relief Organization, which coordinates the entire relief effort here. This UNDRO internal document, an October 1983 situation report, describes a UN mission to Ethiopia which was alarmed by the small proportion of needy people being reached. But UNDRO would never say that publicly.
Are you in a position where it's very difficult for you to criticize the host government if you don't believe they're acting properly?
It is not productive as far as we are concerned. We have to work with the government there. And if we keep criticizing it, it will just create difficulties. And I don't believe it is in our interest to do that when we have so much to do.
The victims on the rebel side are receiving only a tiny fraction of what they need to stay alive. While most of the northern famine victims are on the rebel side, the government side is receiving 20 times more food. Most United Nations agencies are doing little to right the balance.
UNICEF, for example, in September of 1984, put out a statement saying that there were 6 million people in need in northern Ethiopia and only 1 million people could be reached. It's simply not true. The other 5 million can be reached, but they can't be reached through UN channels. Now, I think the United Nations and every other private agency in that area has a responsibility to those people to describe what they can do and what they can't do and what the actual crisis itself entails.
Why cannot the United Nations raise the alarm about this and say the situation as it exists in Ethiopia is that most of the famine victims are not being fed through government channels and that therefore people should be donating food through other channels?
I must tell you that the United Nations, if it did that, a government, the present government, can say this is interference in my own internal affairs. Because they can always find a way of explaining that. And what would serve the United Nations? The United Nations cannot work if the government says, no, stop, you're not allowed to come in.
But surely, when people are starving, if the truth is that relief is not reaching most of the famine victims, that's more important than the diplomatic niceties of the way the United Nations works.
I entirely agree with you as an individual, but as coordinator, I must tell you that in each resolution which has been passed in the United Nations, there has been a paragraph saying the sovereignty of the country must be respected.
What price would the United Nations organizations pay by saying this is the situation, even if it is insulting to the government of Ethiopia?
It will not be able to intervene in the country at all.
You believe that the Ethiopian government would kick out the United Nations organizations?
I tell you that if I do it, Andrew will not be able to work there. That I am not believe, I'm certain.
10 years ago, the UN organizations made a solemn pledge that death by starvation would be eradicated from the planet by 1984. They failed. Until the UN can make an agreement that will eliminate the politics that withholds food from the starving, this scene will happen again and again.
To answer these charges, we have first Ethiopia's ambassador to the United Nations, Berhanu Dinka. Mr. Ambassador, how do you respond to the basic charge in that report that your government is deliberately withholding food from most of the famine victims because they live in the two rebel provinces?
Well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. My reaction to the film that we have just seen is one of indignation, because the whole story is based on hearsay and allegations made by 2 or 3 individuals, namely Dan Connell, Chris Carter, and Mr. Elliott of the British Independent Aid.
All representatives of different independent aid organizations.
Aid organizations who have no, who are not participating in any manner in the assistance that's being given to Ethiopia. They are not operating in Ethiopia. These people are working some in Britain and in Boston. In the case of Mr. Dan Connell and Chris Carter of Grassroots International, they are not operating in Ethiopia. They have not seen what's going on. They have not been there. And basically, the 3 of them are well known to European audiences, to us, to Ethiopians, and to our neighbors as people who have committed themselves for over a decade now to the cause of the rebellion movement in Ethiopia, in the northern region of Ethiopia.
Let me give you an opportunity to answer the very specific charges.
Yes,
you heard not only from them, but from your countrymen who were among those refugees, who say the government is killing refugees. For example, many of them have been strafed from the air by your Air Force.
Now, as the commissioner, Ethiopian Commissioner for Relief and Rehabilitation, Mr. Dawit, was saying on this interview, these people who have gone to the Sudan or to other neighboring countries, it's very easy for anybody who wants to put anything into their mouth to coach them. For instance, if you had looked carefully at the film, when these people were asking them who have been bombed among you, or who have been close to Ethiopian shelter but prefer to come over here, without even the thing being interpreted into their language, the people were raising their hands. And in other interviews, it's always interpreted for them.
I think probably it had been interpreted, but abbreviated so that you didn't have to listen to the interpretation and then the reinterpretation.
In any case,
back.
if you ask me for the
it's a device that's very commonly used to abbreviate it.
Okay. If you ask me for the substance of the issue of those that have been mentioned in the film, whether the Ethiopian government is starving these people intentionally or bombing them when they run across the border, I will say absolutely no basis in these allegations to the 2 questions.
Is your government delivering food to they said 4 million people who live in Eritrea and Tigre? Is your government delivering food to them?
Yes. The Ethiopian government has been delivering and is delivering food to all that are in Ethiopia. One difficulty sometimes limits its efforts, and that's the availability of food and the availability of transportation. But as far as reaching all Ethiopians that are in need, irrespective of where they are located, the Ethiopian government has been doing that.
So you say that report is totally false?
It's absolutely false, and if you give me enough time, I can tell you why it's false and who are doing this. And just to say, before I finish my sentence, the credible non-governmental organizations, the donor countries in Ethiopia, which are operating in Ethiopia, 39 different NGOs have seen this film in Addis Ababa last week, and they all denounced it as malicious, and the surprise that is made in Canada, apparently, by the Canadian television, because the Canadian ambassador was the foremost denouncer of this film.
We'll come back to you, Mr. Ambassador. Now, for the United Nations view, we have Bradford Morse, former member of Congress, who for the last 9 years has headed the UN Development Program, which provides development assistance to 150 countries. In December, he was made the executive director of the UN Office for Emergency Relief Operations in Africa. Mr. Morse, that report also makes a very grave charge about the United Nations, that it is keeping silent about the deliberate starvation of millions. What is your response to that?
There's no doubt that that's an exceedingly serious allegation, and I can merely say the fact that cite the fact that the representative of the United Nations Development Program, who's been in Addis for the last several months, the last 2 years, has again and again called attention of the press and the public generally to the fact that there are areas in the country in which it's difficult to get food because of reasons of topography, because of reasons of fighting that's going on. And certainly there's been absolutely no effort whatsoever to disguise this, to hide it in any way. More recently, the special representative of the Secretary General, who was there in Addis Ababa and has been there now since November, his name is Janssen from Finland, has volunteered to take a convoy, a food convoy, from the railhead Asmara, which is in the north part of the country, across Tigre to Maleke. The permission wasn't forthcoming, but there certainly has been no attempt at all to disguise, to cover in any way.
Well, what does the UN believe? What do you believe about the basic truth of that report, that the majority of people who are hungry are not receiving the aid because they live in those two provinces?
Well, I did note the words of the announcer on the CBC broadcast and just recorded very carefully what he said, and he asserted that the government was holding back food from most of the famine victims. Well, there are in Ethiopia today 7.7 million people who, as we call them, most seriously affected. Of those, 1.5 million are in Tigre, 825,000 are in total in Eritrea. So that's a total of 2.3 plus million out of a total of 7.7 million, which is certainly not the most of the famine victims. It's about 30% that are most seriously affected in these two areas.
Then does that mean that 30% are not being fed?
I can't tell you.
You don't know?
I can't tell you.
Do you have people operating in those two provinces?
We have, as I just indicated, we've offered to bring people through or bring a convoy through. The ICRC...
But the government refused you?
On that one for the reasons of the safety of the participants. We share our work with many other organizations, not least the International Committee for the Red Cross, the ICRC, which does have extensive activities, both in the province of Tigray and Eritrea. And they have many, many feeding stations there that are operated by the International Committee for the Red Cross. Now, this is not to refute what we've just seen on the screen. I can't give you a flat answer to that. I can tell you that certainly we would find it abhorrent, and as we do when you can't reach people. As recently as Saturday of last week, we started new airdrops because there are people not far, 170 miles northwest, 70 kilometers northwest of Addis Ababa, where you can't reach people except by donkey. Well, we started airdrops there just last week, so this is not an unusual circumstance.
So you don't know how many people are not being fed for political or military, because of political or military obstacles?
Well, I'm not in any position to make a judgment on the issue of the motives, nor to provide a precise figure as to the numbers.
Right. We'll come back. Jim?
A third view of it, it's that of Peter McPherson, administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development. Mr. McPherson, is that report totally false on what's happening in northern Ethiopia?
The worst drought problem in Africa today is in northern Ethiopia. There are a couple million people, perhaps, who are in desperate need, and they're not getting the food they should get. A lot of reasons, I suppose. Recently, the Ethiopia government impounded food that was coming into the major port of Ethiopia, but which was bound to go up to Port Sudan and back around across the border into Ethiopia to feed these various people. I noted at that time, of just a few days ago, that that was an unconscionable act, and we deeply believe it to be the case. There are a lot of problems, and these problems simply really must be dealt with. I'm very happy that we have this program tonight.
What is your view of what the Ethiopian government is doing in terms of keeping food out of that area?
I don't know about motives, but the facts are that there are 2 million plus people probably that aren't getting food through up into their area. The Ethiopian government has represented to us that they are prepared to let food go any place in the country solely on the basis of need, and that's what we continue to call for.
But it's not happening.
There are certainly areas where food isn't going. What really needs to be done here is we need to have safe passages for vehicles that carry food. Safe passages not just through the Ethiopian government areas, but through those areas held by the dissidents. Both the dissidents and the government must give such safe passage.
Have you suggested that sort of thing?
We have indeed.
What kind of response have you
Well,
had?
not too much, frankly, so far. Not much from anybody, from either grouping, or there's multiple groupings of the dissidents. I feel confident, and I've studied it at great length, reviewed it again today, and have talked about it, looked at it for months. I feel confident that without such safe passage of food vehicles, and it's not an unusual concept. We've had Red Cross vehicles have such safe passages for decades. Without such safe passage, there are going to be, in our judgment, hundreds of thousands of more people who will die.
What's your view of the charge made in the film against the United Nations?
Well, let me say that I think Brad Morris, assuming this position just a couple weeks ago, is an outstanding move. Brad is a well-regarded person throughout the world and has already proven in a couple weeks his ability to move things around. Recently, a person by the name of Janssen, a Norwegian, has taken over as the coordinator within Ethiopia.
The man we saw on the tape from the United Nations is no longer there, correct?
Well, he no longer has this function. Right. And frankly, I disagree, and I think Mr. Morris would too. I think any official in the UN has a responsibility to speak out on the need for things to be done morally and right.
But from your perspective, have they done so, Mr. McPherson?
I think with Brad there and Janssen there, things are beginning to happen.
But they haven't done it up till now. You would
well,
agree.
They're doing the things they need to do. I really do feel the last few weeks things are beginning to move.
The last few weeks?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Robin?
Mr. Ambassador, both these gentlemen say, without ascribing motives to your government, that a number of people, in the case of Mr. Morris, he doesn't know how many, Mr. McPherson says 2 million people in those provinces are not getting the food they need.
I never denied that. I said as long as our food availability and transportation equipment permits us, there is no place that we have not tried to reach and we could not reach. The problem is sometimes we have no food, even in the port. For instance, out of the 50,000 tons the United States government has pledged to us in October, we have not received so far a single ton. And there are pledges.
Well, let's talk about food quantities first, and then we'll go into the other things.
That's what I'm saying.
Let's get the view of these other two gentlemen.
That's what I'm saying.
Does that ring true to you, that the quantity of food is not there?
I can't speak of the specific circumstance that the ambassador just spoke of, but at this moment, we have absolute schedules for food to come into Ethiopia between January and April of this year, which will total 490 tons. We know when the vessels are arriving, and they're all scheduled, and we don't have any doubt about it's getting there. There are enormous internal logistical problems after food leaves the port to go to warehouses.
But getting to Ethiopia, there is adequate food getting to Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Mr. McPherson, what is your view of that?
That, in fact, in recent weeks, we've been able to move quite a lot of food into Ethiopia. About 100,000 ton plus a month is necessary, and that is now coming in. Most of our food, in fact, all of our food until just this date, has been going through private voluntary organizations like Catholic Relief and World Vision. In a few days, some food will be going into for distribution by the government.
Now, is it do you agree with the 2 million figure? That there are 2 million people who are not being fed?
I don't believe anybody knows exactly how many they are. The thing is, there are areas that are inaccessible. The areas that are inaccessible, I'll give you two reasons. One is inaccessibility because of the topography, which Mr. Morse just referred to, and that we are trying to get by trucks, by donkeys, by airdrop now. We have started last Saturday. And the other one, there are some areas on the border between Ethiopia and the Sudan where there are security problems, and there we have been reaching with military convoys. We have given military convoys to non-governmental organizations like World Vision. They can testify to that.
What about Mr. McPherson's point that what is really needed is for your government to give safe passage for food convoys, and that you've been asked and so far you haven't agreed?
Well, I didn't want to take up this matter, but since Mr. McPherson started it, I'll give you an answer to that. This is not a new idea that's just coming on this television screen. Some governments and some organizations, and particularly the grassroots international people and others, have been trying to let the world buy this kind of idea. It's in a way to give some kind of legitimacy to the rebel groups who are operating and organized from foreign territories, working against us as terrorists, to get some legitimacy for them. The legitimacy that they could not get on the battlefield, that they could not get on political grounds. They want to do it through food.
So you're saying no to safe passage for food convoys through areas you control because it would help the rebels? Is that what you're saying?
No. I'm saying, for example, there is Catholic Relief Services, there is the International Committee for the Red Cross, there is a Lutheran World Federation, Catholic Secretariat, and World Vision, who are right now operating in both Eritrea and Tigre. They are operating there, and we are not hindering their activities.
Let me ask Mr. McPherson
now, they want what we are doing within our own country with these people to make it more legitimate and legalized, some kind of acceptance of the rebellion that was going on against us, instigated by foreign forces, governments.
What's your comment on that, Mr. McPherson?
I think it's important to note that a few months ago, we were very critical, really, of the Ethiopian government generally in terms of how it was handling the drought. In recent months, there has been a substantial additional amount of trucks thrown into the effort by the Ethiopian government, and food began to move. Food is getting to those camps, American food and other food, and children are being fed. I've seen it myself.
But those camps are outside the two rebel provinces.
That's exactly right. The problem that we're facing, and again I would say the worst problem we have in Africa today, is those areas that are in contested control, contested by governments and the dissidents, that 2 million plus perhaps people live in. There's a dispute as to how many, but a substantial number live there, and it is those areas that simply aren't getting the food. We're trying. There's flights going into the Sudan side of the border. There's other work, but we simply aren't getting enough food there, and I'm convinced, and I deeply feel this, and I worked it over many times, I'm convinced that without the ability to move food trucks freely through government-controlled areas, through dissident areas and so forth, we simply will not save the lives of hundreds of thousands of people who will otherwise die.
Do you agree with this?
I agree with it. I do indeed. And I think that it is achievable. I think we should recognize, though, there are a number of camps there that are already being operated under auspices, which is providing food to people. But I would think that if it were possible to do, as Peter said, it would be exceedingly useful, of course.
Yeah. Now, why won't the government let them do that?
Well, I'll tell you what we can do. The Ethiopian government has been doing its best and will continue to do its best to provide food, distribute food to these people on its own, and also at the same time to allow the existing non-governmental organizations like ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross, Lutheran World Federation, Catholic Service, to operate in these areas unhindered. But the kind of food truce or something that you've been hearing in the news media is absolutely unacceptable to us, because there are certain groups who want, as I said earlier, to use this thing for legitimizing their friends,
in other words,
and also for certain governments to put their fingers in our internal affairs. We'll never accept that.
So you're saying that your government is putting obstacles to the operation of some relief agencies in those areas because you fear that they have political motives?
No. I said those who are there, like the International Red Cross, like Catholic Relief Services, Lutheran World Services, who are already there in those provinces, they are operating without hindrance. I'm asking a question: if these people are working without hindrance, if we're trying to reach all these people, why is it that the so-called food truce or something like that necessary? And truce with whom? Which government is fighting us?
Yeah, Mr. McPherson?
Yes, we specifically aren't using the word food truce. We really don't want to get into politics there in Ethiopia. What we're saying is safe passage for food trucks. Safe passage. Everybody allows food trucks to go where they need to go. And I think we want to minimize the interference into the body politic of the country.
And that has not happened.
That has not happened.
And that has not happened.
Well, as I said, these 4 or 5 groups, they're working with trucks, I'm sure. Their trucks are passing. And when Mr. McPherson or anybody says there must be a free passage for trucks, I don't really know what we're talking about, because we already have this free passage for trucks.
Mr. McPherson?
How are these people operating otherwise?
Well, we'd like to see it. And we believe deeply, and I believe the ambassador does as well, that we must feed those millions of people or thousands will die.
We have to leave it there, gentlemen. Mr. Morse, Ambassador Dinka, thank you for joining us. Mr. McPherson in Washington. Jim?
Still to come on the NewsHour tonight, a focus segment on today's Senate testimony by